I'm Dan Snow. Welcome to Voices of the First World War. In the years leading up to the centenary of the war, the last of those who actually experienced it have passed away. But the Imperial War Museums and the BBC had recorded interviews with many veterans to try to capture what it was like to actually be there. This series listens to those stories.
Gibbs Stewart, scene 156, take 1.
Salonica. Turning into the harbour on that old battleship where we had been for 14 days, cooked up. We got into the harbour there, stepped ashore, and started what to us was a long, long journey into the unknown.
We went through the Mediterranean. We didn't know what was in front of us, and I don't suppose we really worried. Troops, in that sense, I don't think they worry about what is ahead of them.
Well, I've never been east. The costumes, the crowded streets, the marketplace. It was also different from London or Hull.
The First World War had begun as an argument between Austria-Hungary and neighbouring Serbia. So by late 1915, when Serbia had been almost overrun by Austria and its Bulgarian allies, it made sense for Britain and France to try and do something to help. They sent hundreds of thousands of men east.
Salonica itself, it looked extremely nice from the boat.
The ship that Private Charles Shepherd had been travelling on through the Mediterranean had been chased by a U-boat, so landing at Salonika in Macedonia seemed like an attractive alternative.
Well, we were very quickly disillusioned. The houses were falling to pieces. The smell and the stench of the place was, well, it was wicked. You had to smell it to believe it.
But we went in Salonika more than 3 or 4 weeks, and then we went up country and made camp near the river Struma.
British officer William Hildred had just staggered off the battlefield at Loos.
And I was astonished the speed with which each group made its tent, got the cookers going, and in about an hour there were as merry as a crowd of people at a fair. Their tents were dry, their food was there, they had enormous opportunism and skill.
The men had no idea what they were going to have to endure.
The weather changed just like that. It just went from hot to cold. In the morning, there was a stream running alongside of us, and we had to break the ice in the stream to wash.
We proceeded to around about Lake Doraine, where the Irish division that had recently come from Gallipoli were dressed in sun helmets and shorts.
Private L. Weeks served in Salonika for a year, from 1915.
And I was helping to cover the retirement of this Irish division, and quite a number of them were joined hands together. They were frostbitten.
We had our washing on the lines between the tent, and they were like boards. You could just catch hold of them like that. They just wouldn't thaw out. Well, we had to dry our shirts somehow. We were not starving by any means. In fact, we had too many hard biscuits. And we had a tin left there, about 2 foot by 18 inches. So what we done, we knocked holes in the side of the biscuit tin, like a brazier, and we stood it up on stones, and we caught fire to the biscuits, and the biscuits burnt just like charcoal. So we had one glorious biscuit fire, and we was all around with our shirts and our pants, drying our shirts and our pants off.
One used to come in after doing the rounds, take one's greatcoat off, and you didn't hang it up, you just stood it on the floor and remained standing there.
Were hostilities really practical in this sort of...
Not in that weather, no. The Bulgars were on the opposite side of a deep ravine, but they were just as cold as we were. We used to see great bonfires going every night, keeping themselves warm. as we did too, no, there was no hostilities at all at that moment.
Compared with the Western Front, there was little large-scale combat. The terrain was unsuitable, and Allied planners didn't want to pour in the vast amounts of resources required for a major push. British officer Hildred was still enjoying himself.
And we had a splendid Christmas, no fighting, got a turkey, and went into the village for eggs and food.
As the winter wore on, we gradually found that no attack was coming our way. I might say that a wind blew there called the Varder wind that could freeze you to death in next to no time. It actually did freeze and kill horses as they stood.
Set to work building roads in what felt like a backwater, the men began to wonder why they were there.
I wouldn't like to say what it was, but it was intended to keep the Bulgars from coming down to Salonica. I don't think they had any idea of doing it.
Over the other side of the hills, the line had been dug to defend Salonica, as they thought the Bulgars and the Germans would attack. And one of the most peculiar things that I saw in this line was a huge trench, 20 or 30 feet down, and big bamboo spikes and iron spikes stuck upright in it, so that we couldn't be taken by surprise, I presume that was. Real old-fashioned methods.
There's a lot of sand with, like ditches, full of dead mules stinking to high heaven, full of wild dogs too. But we could watch the Bulgars, and they'd occasionally bomb, but to begin with, not very much. We'd occasionally go across the river, which was shallow, on a raid. I remember one raid, all we got was one donkey and one egg, which wasn't really worthwhile.
All hills and mountains. It seemed almost as though the desert got mixed up with the mountain, I think. It was so desolate, and the mountains were so high, they looked down at you somehow, and it seemed as though the devil was on the top laughing at you. And our voices in some places would re-echo and come back to us.
We had one big fight before the weather got so hot and the mosquitoes so big. There was this fight, there were odd fights.
Tired of trench digging, tired of road making, by now we began to realise that we were an orphan army, a lost army. We had been dumped there, left there. All we prayed for and hoped for was, let us have some action, let us get into things, let us do something. And I might say that the army I belonged to was a Kitchener army, men drawn from every walk of life, professors, doctors, even ministers in the ranks. No emergency arose but what we had an answer to. The miner with his blasting and his control of gunpowder, the joiner, the builder, the doctor.
Our diet during those times consisted of a handful of dates, the hard biscuit, and the bully beef. You can imagine that after a couple of years of that, resistance to disease was very, very low. One other thing, why the men began to get very despondent, there was no leave for a very, very considerable time. It was too far to bring the soldier home. People were run down, really run down.
And we had our interesting sidelines, one being that a zeppelin gifted by the Kaiser to King Ferdinand of Bulgaria sailed over once a week, reconnaissance. We had nothing in the way of weapons to do anything with it. That zeppelin came over once too often in the spring. In the harbour there happened to be a gunboat with a very intelligent captain aboard. And when he saw this gigantic airship travelling slowly round about, viewing everything. He shifted his load, shifted his guns, his ammunition, hung his crew on the rail and canted his gunboat to such an angle that he was able to get a shot at it. Smoke and flame. It turned and headed for home, but only reached the Vardar marshes and landed, ironically enough, amongst the Serbs. I can't tell you the numbers of the crew of that zeppelin, but the story given to us was, as each member of the crew tried to escape, the Serbs just threw them back into the flames, and there was no survivors.
There was a Greek selling tangerines and figs at an old shack away from the camp. And he said to us, he said, "You English," he said. 1 month, he said. "You sick," he said. 2 months, he said. More sick, he said. 3 months, he said. English, he said. Penny, gone, he said. Of course, we enjoyed a good laugh. I mean, it didn't go down with us very well because, of course, we were tough and we thought we was tough enough to, to go on better than that. Anyway, we had very good reason later to remember the words that the Greek told us.
More than 400,000 British soldiers would see service in Salonika from 1915 onwards. Only around 20,000 were killed or wounded in fighting, but more died of disease, and hundreds of thousands had to be evacuated as they were sick.
I think it had the reputation of being the most malarial district in Europe. Messes of mosquitoes, of course, which started about May and went on till the end of September. And when we went, there was no precautions, there was no mosquito netting issued. There was nothing, so the troops just went down like flies.
The weather got hotter. There was a lake 20 miles long, and the army sent us 1 gallon of paraffin to kill all the mosquitoes on a lake 29 miles long. Didn't have much effect. Most of them got on my forearm, and I remember saying, well, they won't damage me, I'm too healthy. And these damn great things were sucking away, and I got a dreadful dose of malignant malaria.
The sickness became very prevalent in the August 16. I was put in with malaria and dysentery in a cattle truck, wrapped in a blanket. I was sponged down in cold water. I eventually arrived at Salonika, where there was a base hospital.
I lost 4 stone in 5 days. I think I nearly died because I got a very bad dose through showing off.
For those who stayed there, like Private William Gibbs Stewart, Salonika remained a terribly hard posting until the armistice in 1918.
The eeriness of it all was something that I don't think anyone could describe. That feeling of insecurity, your flanks exposed. All the shelter we had in daylight was to crawl round to the back of the hill, scrape a hole out, and put that magnificent bivvy sheet that we had been issued with, put it above the little cave you dug, put rocks on the top of it, drape it down, and crawl in there like a lizard or a wild animal and seek some sleep.